Can you even tell I'm a retiree? Want the list of things I take and stuff I do to look like I'm not on my way to 62? Then, like, share, comment, and subscribe, and then get in the Discord. Link in the description box down below. Speaking of not looking like you're halfway to the grave, Discord, it's a thing. Kind of like the community, center where people go to hang out and talk and play games and sometimes get hot dogs or taquitos if there was a roach coach nearby back in the day. Or you'd call it a community center online for us older folk. You could join, everybody else here on the channel talking about anything and everything. You get guaranteed notifications in the Brigade Assembly area when I do anything and everything. There's a meme channel thing with stuff I can't really explain, although that's cool. And then you can send requests for what you want me to see directly to me. And then there's a general voice channel. You could join me on live streams and scream at me about, I don't know, I guess you could just scream at me. Alright, I haven't done this in forever. It's been a long time, my fellow ex-combat veteran. So, that being said, from MrBallen. Top 5 Bingeable Scary Stories, Strangest of the Strange Edition, Volume 2. I know I'm going to like it. I'm subscribed to them after. Why do they keep turning off all my notifications? YouTube is such crap. They do this kind of shit all the time. They'll unsubscribe me. I'll wonder why I don't see someone's shit in my notifications. And then I check and I'm like only subscribed personally. And it got changed by YouTube for no inexplicable goddamn reason. YouTube, get your shit together. That being said, from MrBallen, let's see who's alive and who's dead, shall we? All right, let's go.
A special bonus video for you guys.
Oh, wait, I forgot. I gotta do the backwards hat thing all the vets do. That being said, I don't really know why it started, except ghetto culture back in the day. Because wearing the hat backwards was kind of like... Oh, wait, no. Maybe it was workers first. Because people would wear ball caps all the time. But then you had to put on headgear, and you put the ball cap, bill behind... Well, I don't know when it started exactly. But I'm old enough to remember it wasn't usually a thing, and then it became a big one. That being said, let's jump in.
It's a collection of 5 strange but true stories that all basically sound like they were pulled out of a fiction novel, but they really happened. Now, even if you have heard or seen some of these stories before, don't worry, they have all been completely re-edited, so it will feel like a brand new viewing experience. And if you didn't know, this is actually part 2 of this particular video series. You can find the link to part 1 in the description below or at the end of today's video.
Link to original content always will be in my description box, because you give credit where credit's due. Thankfully, he doesn't strike down channels for enjoying watching him and sharing the experience. Or people asking me to watch him and then tell them what my take on it is and do the commentary. Thank you very much, my fellow veteran.
But before we get into today's 5 stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button very politely asks you to hand them their reading glasses, oblige them, but be sure you first fully submerge their glasses in fried chicken grease. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads.
Oh man. Fried chicken grease. It's making me hungry. Tell you what though, one of the healthiest things you can eat possibly right now, even though it's semi-processed, is meat. Meat products, animal products. They are for the most part untouched by the toxicity and the chemicals and all that garbage everything else is chock full of nowadays that bloats you and makes you fat. How do I know? Well, I've proven this multiple times. I've gone on the average diet, gotten fat, and then proved you could lose 30 pounds within 2 weeks by switching back to a healthier and much more conducive diet, and then just doing a couple miles every day, and that's it. Want me to do it again? You let me know. If enough people get on the channel, I'll do it again, and I'll record the whole thing again. But yeah, that being said, that does remind me of that, right? Because some butter fried chicken with some tahine. Delicioso. Well, anyway, sorry. I'm a little hungry right now.
Okay, let's get into today's stories.
I gotta pause halfway through this because YouTube hates me. So, because if I play this all the way, YouTube will strike the content. Because, well, YouTube's just YouTube. They're a bunch of commie suckers. So they love being little Stalins. So I do have to pause it a lot more than often is necessary. But let's continue. Oh, a phantom! The Phantom of the Opera is here within my mind.
On February 17th, 2004, shoppers inside of a massive Japanese superstore called Jusco in Wakachi City were suddenly aware of a loud commotion. When they went to investigate, they found a thin young woman with a young baby strapped to her chest, grappling with an older man. Initially, onlookers didn't know what to do. They stood there shocked at what they were seeing. Then the woman yelled out, "Thief!" The man she was fighting with was in his late 60s, and he had pinned the woman and her baby up against this bank of ATMs, and his fists were clenched like he was holding whatever it was he took from her. 3 men from the crowd immediately jumped into action and wrestled the man off of the woman and pinned him to the ground and began trying to pull his hands open to take out whatever he had stolen from this woman, but the man would not unclench his fists. And so these 3 men yelled out to the police that happened to be nearby. They ran over and jumped on top of this guy and handcuffed him. And the man, as he's laying on the ground, is yelling out that he did nothing wrong. And then onlookers would say he began moaning very strangely before he began violently vomiting before falling unconscious. While the police waited.
Uh-oh. What did the female do to him? What did that woman do? I'm immediately suspicious of the female, right? Because you have a tendency of females. Well, I know this is Japan, but you have a greater tendency of females making false allegations, percentage-wise, than you do males who commit actual crimes. So I'm immediately suspicious of the woman, right? This could be one of those cases. Then again, I can always easily be wrong. Just because the statistics are super high does not at all mean it's every single case. But I am suspicious. Hashtag don't believe all women.
For emergency services to show up and take this man to the hospital. They were able to open up his fist and discovered the only thing he was clutching was his own bank card that was now bent in 3 places. The wallet he had on him belonged to him, and the bags that were lying on the ground all around him only contained some pet supplies that he had recently purchased. It did not appear he had actually taken anything from this woman.
Let me guess. And the female is nowhere to be found. She disappeared. Everybody immediately pounced on the guy, assuming him as the aggressor, and it turns out it was a female that was playing everybody all along using emotional manipulation. Why? Because it's a default of civilized societies to defend those who are seemingly the weak, right? And the less fortunate. Usually those who take such action are going to be men, except for Western civilization. One side of that gender war totally destroyed any trust there was in that gender, but that's beside the point. Yeah, so my suspicion seems much more correct right off the bat. Just because the statistics are high, super high, doesn't mean it's every case, but it does mean it's the majorities.
And speaking of this woman, the police were so caught up in the chaos of the moment that they hadn't even thought to look around for the victim to see if she was okay. So they poke their heads up and start looking around the crowd for this woman, but she's nowhere to be seen.
I haven't even seen this one yet, and I already know what's going to happen. Or at least I have a greater chance of being right than I am wrong. So yeah, I mean, if you go just by FBI statistics, before they tried to purge a lot of their data because it didn't look favorable at all, and they were more worried about looking good than reporting the truth, which is never a good thing for any organization that's supposed to fight crime and protect the people to do. Before they purged a lot of their data they had collected over decades, it was around in the 70s of percents that women would make false allegations against men, and then the percentage of women that would use because they had like different ladders of different data, but the percentage that would just make the false allegations was in the high 70s, close to 80%. And the percentage that would use false allegations for a criminal net benefit outcome of some kind for themselves against the man was even higher. So it was above 80%, which is reflected directly in marriage and divorce statistics and such, according to CDC. So, but when you parse all that data, it's kind of hard. You got to look all the way at the bottom for it. But yeah, if you make such assumptions based upon empirical data and statistics, you have a higher chance probability of being correct than you are incorrect. Thus, I was able to just take a guess and be like, nope, this doesn't seem right.
So they asked the crowd, do we know who she is or where she went? And nobody knew. The police did think it was odd that this woman had walked off without talking to them first, but they figured if she walked away, then everything must be fine. And so they labeled the incident an attempted robbery, and they closed the case. The following day,
and the man still took the heat. And the man was still labeled a criminal. With no evidence, period. Just emotionally reactionary witnesses who are doing what a civilized society is literally taught and trained to do.
the older man, who became known as Mr. A by police, died at the hospital as a result of heart failure caused by extreme stress. When the police found out about this, they simply went into the case file, updated it to show the suspect had died, and did not investigate further. But Mr. A's family refused to believe he had just attacked a young woman and her baby. It was completely out of character. He was a gentle retiree who had spent 40 years working for a chemical manufacturer and now was collecting a pension and working part-time as a security guard. He lived with his wife, his children, and his grandchildren, and he lived about a kilometer away from the Jusco, where he had gone that day to get some hamster food for his grandson's hamster. His family pleaded with police to reopen the case and investigate this woman because she must have done something to start this altercation. The police initially resisted, but ultimately conceded and said, okay, we'll check the CCTV camera footage at the Jusco to make sure we didn't miss anything.
The pursuit of truth and justice should not be limited to someone's willingness to do so. It really shouldn't. It should be regardless of anything else and any all factors. The pursuit of justice and truth should not be limited to someone's willingness to do so, especially if it's their frickin' job. And yes, I would happily die on that hill and have a bunch of bodies around me.
And what they discovered terrified them. A camera overlooking the ATM bank where this whole scuffle went down picked up this woman about 5 minutes before Mr. A walked into frame. She was standing in a corner just off to the side of the ATMs, and she did appear to have a 2-year-old or 1-year-old strapped to her chest, and she was just standing there motionless with her back to the corner looking down. And then when Mr. A came into frame, he appeared to pull some money out of the ATM. He had bags all over his arms. He turned around after getting his cash and started walking away. And as soon as he does, the woman in the corner suddenly becomes animated. She lifts her head up and walks straight past him, skimming his chest with her hand as she passed. And right after she did that, it was like Mr. A had a reaction to being touched by her, and he instinctively grabbed her arm, and that's when the struggle ensued, and that's when the woman yelled out thief, although it's clear from the footage that she is the aggressor, not Mr. A.
Yeah, Yep. Fits the profile. What's even more damning is that law enforcement failed on every level. They did not. They failed to do a fully in-depth investigation. So they failed this man initially and immediately. They failed him at his death, and they failed him after death. And it took so long for the scales of justice to be rebalanced and the truth to be unveiled. Man, oh man, I understand why some people hate cops, right, and police and law enforcement because of stuff like this. Unfortunately, there's not too many people can do about it. I've tried to do things about it and tried consulting at law enforcement on every level, everywhere I could. They don't listen. Why? They're not incentivized to do so. That's the problem. There's no incentive to actually pursue truth, justice, as the ultimate goals, and instead are subject to whoever it is that's signing their paychecks. That's how it works, unfortunately. So, yeah. Now, in Japan, it's quite a bit different because there's more of a cultural incentive going on. But, unfortunately, in Japan, they are kind of hamstrung. Even though they have an incredible, prosecution rate. Incredible. Although, they do end up rolling in some good people into that. It turns out Blackstone's formulation isn't as correct as everyone assumed. Anyway, let's continue. Sorry.
And then at some point, the 3 men jump out of the crowd, they pull him to the ground, the police show up, and then at some point during this chaotic melee, the woman just stands up and meanders her way into the crowd and disappears. Although the police searched every piece of footage in and around this ATM all around the time of the incident, they never found any footage of this woman entering or exiting the Jusco. It was like she just appeared in that corner in order to go after Mr. A and then vanished as soon as it was done. And none of the dozens of witnesses that watched the scuffle take place right in front of them in broad daylight were able to provide any sort of meaningful description of this woman. It was like nobody got a really good look at her. But after reviewing hours and hours of the CCTV footage, the police did find one instance where this woman, for 1 second, looked up at a camera exposing her face. And her face was so unsettling to police that they actually decided not to share the image with the public for an entire year. They were scared that if people saw this image, it would scare them from ever going back to Jusco. This is the image of the woman. As you can see, her face is totally emotionless, her eyes are blank and downcast. Some have compared her face to a death mask, which is a plaster cast of a dead person's face.
It would not surprise me if this ended up being a dead person's face put upon this person's face. It wouldn't surprise me. However, it looks like honestly, to me, it's not disturbing at all. I've seen real dead people, so this has no effect on me. Well, a lot of them I made, but that comes with the job. But it looks almost like they they have something on their face, either some kind of makeup or cream of some kind, or they have some kind of near replicant mask that's just kind of discolored, right? So so I've used these before too. There is disguises that you could put upon your face that completely can meld to your face, and they're seamless. As in, even if you look around the corners and everything, I mean, it's a full glove, and it works wonders with transforming how you look. And it doesn't really matter your size or height or whatever. And you can have those on, but if they're on for much too long. I don't know if they've changed this or not. Because for the more natural ones, they have to use more natural stuff that's less irritant and all that, so you're not needlessly touching your face too much. Um, and but if they're not cleaned, refreshed, and all of that, they can deteriorate because of the material they're made out of. You can also get the ones that are kind of like a semi-rubber or semi-silicone or some stuff like that. They last a lot longer, but they can also degrade if they're left to the elements too much as well. Um, but yeah, it looks like they could be wearing some kind of disguise, or they're wearing some kind of cream or something on their face, or they have a near replicative mask. Fogging hell. I don't even know if I'm saying that right. It's been so long. Or some approximation of that to kind of make it to where they're harder to identify, right? So take for instance any type of cosmetics. If I clean shave, right? If I perfectly clean shave, and then I put on some mascara, a few levels of makeup, lipstick, right? And then I put in contacts, colored contacts to change my eye color. And I put on a seamless wig. And then, I just have a hoodie on and some baggy pants, right? And I change my posture. I could look exactly like a female. And I mean exactly, just with a bigger schnoz. And cameras searching for me specifically, or anyone that looks approximate to me, can be fooled by that. It is scary kind of stuff you could do with level 4 disguises. Hell, I already look pretty Middle Eastern just with the structure of my face and my head. I'm up in part Iberian and North African, so that just comes with it. And if I grow out the beard, I let it go all straight out, and I dapper it straight, and then I put on a keffiyeh or anything, cap, hat, whatever. I literally can look like I'm from anywhere in the Middle East, and I can pass along too. And all I need to do is tan. And you know what? Even the United States government couldn't find me. And how I know is because I've done that before. And it wasn't because I was trying to hide from those who sent me over there. It was because we were in the middle of doing something. I couldn't get comms with anybody, so I had to move locations, and they freaked out because they still couldn't find me, even though they passed drone over me a bunch of times. And those cameras on those things are real good. But yeah, they thought I was somebody else entirely after they finally identified which one of the individuals they zoomed in on was me. Even though they already had, they already had pictures of what I was supposed to be. Well, anyway, nobody cares too much about those details. Just needless to say, this is something a little different just to put the face off, right? They know there's cameras. They know they need to conceal their identity. So they put anything and everything on their face to obscure. I'd be surprised if they actually identified this woman.
Other people have said she doesn't even look human. After seeing the CCTV footage, Mr. A's relatives sued the police for detaining him and pinning him to the ground despite his obvious medical distress as a result of whatever this woman did to him. Eventually, they did reach a settlement, but what they really wanted was an explanation for who this woman was. But even after the police released this strange photo to the public, nobody ever came forward, so she was never identified. And it's unlikely she'll ever be identified because the statute of limitations for this case expired in 2011. The case, which is now referred to as the Jusco Phantom, is still very famous in Japan, and it remains a popular topic on long internet chat room threads where people exchange this eerie photograph and speculate about who or what killed Mr. A.
It also could be artifacting from the fact that they had to really zoom in when they pulled the image, right? So that can also help with a obscuring identity as well, because you're trying to get a bit clearer picture by zooming in, but you can see the obvious pixelation from the stuff behind her. It wasn't a good quality camera to begin with, and this didn't make it any better.
In 2007, 35-year-old Eva Wisniewska was a member of the German national paragliding team. Over the previous 2 years, Eva had competed in 10 of the world's biggest paragliding competitions, and she had won 6 of them, making her the top female paraglider in the world. So coming into that year, Eva was very motivated to work extra hard to make sure she retained that title as world champion. On February 24th of that year, Eva was preparing her gear alongside 200 other paragliders on Mount Bora in New South Wales, Australia. This was Eva's last training opportunity before her first major competition of that year, which was scheduled for the next week.
She went to Mount Bora? This already is starting off not very good.
They were getting ready to launch, one of the coaches walked in front of the group and made an announcement. He said storm clouds have been spotted to the north, but the forecast was a little bit ambiguous. It wasn't clear if the storm was going to move over their training area or not. So it was up to each of the paragliders if they still wanted to launch that day and risk the bad weather. Eva, who was really eager to get this training flight in, looked at the sky and saw that it was pretty gray, but decided that she was going to do it. Worst case scenario, she would have to cut it short. The rest of the German national team, they didn't want to take the risk, and so they stayed grounded that day.
It looked a little gray, huh? Changes in weather can come very quickly, within hours. Hours may not sound like a very long time, but if you're already hundreds of miles, right, or even dozens of miles from safety and you can't get to safety quick or any shelter, and you're high in the sky, I mean, I've gone through like smaller storm cells, but that by itself, look, jumping from a plane's already dangerous. Gliding and all that, being in the sky at all, where you have very limited control, is already very dangerous and it's high risk. Doing it while there's very dangerous weather is even worse. You can make it through, sure, but there's a reason why the vast majority of the time, everybody always waits for clear and perfectly clear, maybe for the next few days, weather. Because if you end up in a storm, you get blown off, blown around, thrown around in any way. I mean, heck, this stuff even affects airplanes. And you're a glider? Yeah. Plus, it's Bora. It's really not that safe.
Ava took a little bit longer preparing her gear, so by the time she was lining up on the cliff, she was only one of a handful of people that remained. And so strapped into her glider, she took a good run forward and launched herself up into the air. On the ground, the rest of the German national team followed in a van to track her progress and checked in with her from time to time with their radio. The first part of Ava's journey was incredibly calm. She followed the ridgeline from Mount Bora for 12 miles until it ended. At that point, she entered into the skies over the vast savanna. As her GPS and tracking log ticked, tracking her progress, two large thunderstorm clouds appeared in front of her, one larger than the other. The vast majority of the other paragliders that had launched that day had launched ahead of Ava, and so when these clouds appeared, they had already passed that section, and so they didn't need to contend with the storm. As for Ava and the other two people she was with, which was an Austrian team member and a Chinese team member, they had a decision to make. They could either immediately ground their flight to avoid the storm, or they could attempt to dodge it. They chose the latter. They knew it was too dangerous to try to fly underneath these clouds because of something called updraft. At the beginning of storms, warm air is sucked up from the ground up into these clouds, and a paraglider, if they get caught in that, can get sucked up with the air into the storm. And so Ava and the other two paragliders began aggressively flying around the outside of these clouds when all of a sudden the storm completely changed. The big cloud overtook the small cloud, creating this 12-mile wide cumulonimbus cloud that now all three paragliders were stuck inside of. Any updraft is dangerous to a paraglider, but the updraft of a cumulonimbus cloud is famously dangerous because it's extremely powerful and it lasts for over an hour. The Austrian man was able to pull down on one toggle, point his feet, and begin spiraling all the way out of the grasp of this updraft. And he said he turned to look at the other two, and he didn't see the Chinese man, but he did see Ava, and she was desperately trying to do what he was doing and spiral down, but she was clearly caught in the updraft, and he watched her get pulled up into the black cloud out of view. By the time the Austrian man hit the ground, he would say it had become the worst thunderstorm he had ever seen, with huge hail balls hitting the ground all around him. He took one more look up and he didn't see the Chinese man, he didn't see Ava anywhere, and he took off running for a barn to seek shelter. And when he was there, he pulled out his radio and he alerted the other teams of this emergency. Inside the cloud, Ava was hurtling up like a rocket. The storm was lifting her at a rate of 60 feet per second. There was nothing she could do to get out of this wind tunnel. Ava knew she was getting pulled towards the storm's eye in its vicious center because of the immense claps of thunder that just kept getting louder and louder, and it also kept getting darker and darker all around her. In fact, it was pitch black except for the occasional flash of lightning that came very close to electrocuting her. As she desperately tried to keep her glider stable, she was able to place a radio call down to her team on the ground, but all she could say was, "I can't see anything," before it cut out. And at some point, Ava reached the eye of the storm where it's pitch black and the temperatures are freezing and hail balls the size of oranges are pelting her left and right, and the updraft kept pulling her higher and higher and higher until she passed out from a lack of oxygen. And at some point, this updraft actually shot her up and out of the cloud. And while this meant she was out of the storm, she was now in air that was 50 degrees below zero, which meant everything, her face, her gloves, her clothes, the wings of her glider, everything completely froze. And to make matters worse, at the altitude she was at, there was almost no oxygen and she did not have a breathing apparatus.
So y'all ever see like those pictures of people doing a halo jump? Y'all see these pictures of us doing this shit? There's a reason why. There's a reason why a good amount of the time, right? Where, we either wear masks or at certain altitudes, right? We're either wearing masks or we're maskless, but in certain places or certain regions. But if you're at a high enough altitude, having a mask is a necessity. Why? It's feeding you oxygen. It's keeping you conscious, right? And, I'm keeping it as simple as I can. There's much more to it, yeah, but I'm keeping it simple, short, and sweet. There's a reason why, right? We have all this extra gear and shit on us. And, we look like we're pilots that jumped out of the pilot seat, right? Because all of that shit's necessary. Absolutely so. The gloves and everything, I swear to God. But yeah, it's because of shit like this.
So by all
It's very fun. In fact, it's hell of a thrill. I hate being in the plane, though. I fucking hate the plane. I hate being in that aircraft and being like, oh, when is this freaking can gonna fall? I hate that shit. Although the bigger birds that are jets and not planes and they're not rotary wing, those are a lot smoother. A shit ton smoother. Talking about like well, anyway, nobody cares too much about that. I hated being in the plane because if the thing goes down and they don't open shit fast enough because you're fucking zooming to the ground, and I've had an emergency landing or two and they were not fun. And you're zooming toward ground, it is still a risk jumping out the back. Right? Now, or the side, depending on how fast you're going. Because you don't want to get smacked into the side of the plane, or you don't want to like hit just violent freaking winds and then get buffeted around and it's hard to correct. However, I loved being out of the plane, not in it. Right? I don't know where I get that from. And I was always just afraid of static heights, so like the jump towers and shit, fucking terrified. I'll get up there and do it, but I am sweating bullets the whole time. I'm like, oh God. But as soon as I'm free falling and, I got nothing to worry about. I don't know why. Someone can probably explain it. But it's for shit like this. Just in case it happens. Right? Because she's gone up into like almost the lower atmosphere at that point, where the temperature is super freezing. But yeah, anyway. And she was getting hit with hail the size of frickin' oranges and shit. It's a miracle she didn't get knocked out straight up. Everything must have missed her face. And she must have been beat by the time she got up there. No, brother.
accounts, Ava should be dead. But somehow, she didn't die. She just kept floating around above this storm cloud for 45 minutes. And then something happened. The ice on one side of the glider broke off, causing it to collapse, throwing her into a deadly free fall, and she's not in control, she's still unconscious, and she starts barreling back towards the ground like gravity has been turned back on again, going straight through the storm all over again. And so through the storm, going at 90 feet per second, she clears the storm, and then right after getting out from underneath it, her glider miraculously just opens back up again. And the jerking motion of her suddenly stopping her free fall jolted her awake. And so she's looking around, totally confused as she's gradually regaining consciousness, and she's taking stock of where she is, and she's still in the storm cloud, but right at the bottom of it. But luckily, the updraft had stopped. And so she was steady, and she was able to reach up and grab her toggles, and she was able to fly herself down to the ground and crash land, and then she curled into a ball, grabbed her radio, and she called her team.
Talk about a miracle of freaking miracles. That is miraculous. Hell, she's almost like on level with me when it comes to miraculous shit happening to them. I've been blowing out the turrets, trucks, blown off mountains, fell off a mountain, right? I've had all sorts of shit happen to me, blown up a lot of times too. That happens. You know, I've survived shit no one else did, so I feel a bit of a kinship with her. I'm not gonna lie.
When they heard her voice, they could not believe she was alive, because the other paraglider that got sucked up by the updraft, the guy from the Chinese national team, he unfortunately was struck by lightning and was killed. And so they were anticipating finding out that Ava had been struck by lightning as well.
Oh, Damn. Poor dude. Poor dude. Rest in peace. It takes a few brave souls, doesn't it?
But Ava had not just survived. When they brought her to the hospital, they discovered that virtually nothing was wrong with her. She had some pretty bad bruises and cuts from the hail, and she had a little bit of frostbite on her face, but it was treatable, and so the same day she was brought in, they discharged her. After leaving the hospital, she and her teammates went back to the launch site so she could collect her gear, and when they got there, she looked at her GPS, and the GPS had been tracking her entire flight the entire time she was up in that cloud. And she showed her teammates what it said, and they literally couldn't believe it. The screen showed she had reached an altitude of 32,634 feet, which, to put this in perspective,
that's the altitude fucking commercial aircraft fly at all the time. Around 30,000 feet. Hell, that's what average military aircraft are going to be doing too, because they do a lot of the same flight patterns and such, but can deviate. Especially if you're doing like Halo and, you know, all that stuff. But, damn. Holy shit. She literally became something approximating a commercial aircraft for however long she was at that altitude. Holy shit.
Is the same altitude you fly at inside of a commercial jet. So imagine being outside of your plane in the middle of a flight, and that's how high she was. Another reference point is she was approximately 4,000 feet higher than the summit of Mount Everest. No human being had ever been that high, unprotected, and lived to tell the tale. Until Ava.
Well, holy shit, good on her. You know, lucky she survived. Like I said, miraculous. And without a mask and everything. I mean, yeah, you could do halo jumps without them, but there's a reason why the vast majority don't. Oh boy.
In the early morning hours of June 10th, 1994, Deborah Hoyt suddenly woke up in the middle of the night. She and her husband were staying with relatives in Sacramento, California, and they were supposed to be there for the next couple of days. But as she was sitting there, she had this overwhelming urge to want to leave right then and there and head back to their home in Lake Tahoe. Because she didn't really know what to make of this overwhelming feeling, she shook her husband awake and told him about it. She thought that maybe something was wrong, and he said, you know what, you probably just had a bad dream and you're kind of waking up still half in your dream. It's not a big deal. Just go back to bed. I'm sure everything is totally fine. And in the morning, if you still want to, I'd be happy to leave. And so Deborah said, yeah, you're right. I'm totally overreacting. I'm sure it was just a dream. And she laid back down to try to go back to sleep. But as she laid there, that sense of dread that something was wrong and that she had to leave right now, it was just growing and growing and growing until she just jumped out of the bed and she's just standing in the room and she says to her husband, honey, we gotta go right now. I don't know what's wrong, but we gotta go right now.
You know, there is the potential for human beings to have something approximating some kind of, if you're familiar with Warhammer 40k Psyker powers, right? Powers originating through the mind. You know, telepathy or psychic powers. What's the other? There's telepathy, there's telekinesis, pyrokinesis, all these kind of... There is potential for it. Since, well, the only difference between having it and not is mechanical. So think about it this way. This pen, it's mechanical, right? Now think of it as a lighter. The only difference between, you know, the potentiality for using your mind to have the same effect as a pen, right? is the mechanical aspect is just so easy, simple, and already done, right? Or at least that's some of the theories behind it. Because there are people who are able to do things that are unexplainable by direct, uh, um, that are unexplainable by scientific generality when it comes to these things. And there's so much data behind, they say it's anecdotal, but when you take it in total combined mass, the data and reports about such things being true, that gut feeling turns out to be true way more often than not with the vast majority of reports, right? So someone saying, something felt off about this dude, this girl, something set me off about her, or take the newest lingo, triggered, being triggered by something. For some people, seeing my face is triggering. For others, right, not seeing a face in a video is triggering. So there's all these different capacity and potential and capability that the human biology and physiology effects for us in order to be conducive to us. So it's the difference between shaking off an uneasy feeling and ending up dead in an alleyway, right? Or, you being suspicious of someone and later those suspicions being proven correct. It could be a combination of factors or just a simple gut feeling that your conscious mind is not able to register from your subconscious except as a physical reaction, right? So, yeah, I'm just laying that on the table. But this is something in the tactical world, right, that more often than not, unfortunately, has to be overcome to a certain extent, unless it's super strong. Now, we don't talk about this too much outside of military training, because you don't want people to think you're anything but just a direct, materialistic, strictly professional operator, right? You don't want people to think you're some kook or think you're a weirdo or whatever, even though the CIA has already done shit that is definitely beyond all that, with like MK Ultra and, the research on the spirit world and all that. But in the tactical world, we do encounter stuff like this, and we learn, especially with the seasoned guys, to listen to it, right? So it's the difference between kicking in that door and the whole building blowing up in your face, or having a reasonable reaction to your gut telling you something's wrong and therefore changing the plan on the ground to accommodate for it so you don't needlessly sacrifice your team because you ignored what it was your physiology and biology was telling you. Anyway, that being said, let's continue. But I'm just saying all of that just to say that there is potential for the human, meat suit and stuff like that to pick up things your conscious mind misses, unless you're highly hypervigilant like one of us. So, yeah, I'm just throwing that out there. But this stuff's very interesting to me, and I like it a lot.
And her husband did not want to go. And he said, "Come on, Deborah, get back in bed. It's not a big deal." But she was adamant. She said, "Get out of bed. We're leaving right now." And so begrudgingly, her husband said, "Okay, we'll leave right now." And so the two of them hastily packed up and then went down.
All right, honey. Fine. We're going. Shit. Oh, man. I know that feeling. Kind of miss it, but you know what? The peace is worth more than the potentiality for divorce.
downstairs and left a note for their relatives explaining their absence, and then they got in their car and they drove off. After a little while, the couple reached a very dangerous section of their journey back home. It was called Bullion Bend, and it was a very windy road up in the mountains where one wrong turn and you're going flying down the side of a mountain. After driving through this area for about 15 minutes, they rounded a particularly sharp turn, and as soon as they made the turn and could look down the road, Deborah, who was in the passenger seat, she saw up ahead on the right, off the side of the road several feet, something that was just lying there on the side of the road.
All right, we are back. All right, let's go.
She didn't know what it was. She thought it was maybe a bag or some trash or maybe a dead animal. And at first she was just going to dismiss it. But as her husband drove closer and closer to it, the light began to illuminate it, and she looked at it and couldn't really discern what it was until they were right next to it. And she looked out her window and she noticed it was a woman's body, a woman who had no clothes on, who was just lying there totally motionless. And Deborah immediately turns to her husband and says, "Honey, I just saw a dead woman on the side of the road." And her husband immediately is kind of panicked and doesn't slow down. He just keeps driving and says, "Hey, should we stop? Should we turn around? I mean, maybe she's not dead. Maybe we can help her." But Deborah at this point is now terrified, and she's saying, "No, keep going. Don't go back. I bet it's a trap. Someone probably put her there, and they're going to lure us in, and they're going to attack us if we try to stop and help her." And so in this kind of chaotic, frenzied reaction that Deborah and her husband are having, they decide that their best course of action is just to drive on and find the next payphone and call the police.
Very smart. Very smart. Much as you want to, right? This is a common case. This is a common occurrence, much more common than most people think. Is the use of, is the use of bait, right? So it's much more common than people want to admit it. But what really, really just deeply dark, disturbed, evil people will do, because they want to get to you. And these are not humans like you and I think of ourselves, right? In between you and me, I assume there's some civility. We live in a civilized society between us, right? And we expect such courtesy in between each other to a certain extent and a certain point, right? Thus, why it's called a civilization and not a barbarianation or something like that, or chaos or anarchy or something like that. Because in a civilization, it is a social contract between individuals to trust, okay, I'm not going to do anything wrong to you. You're not going to do anything wrong to me. And we're going to decide together collectively, we will be civil and thus treat each other as humanely as possible, long as there's no malicious action conducted between the two, between me and you. And so that's how we work as humans, being humane to each other. And we have morality and ethics based upon such that brought this into creation, right? And led to the greatest civilization to exist. However, there's always outliers everywhere. Although in some cultures, they're the majority, not the outlier, because of how their culture exists. I've experienced them. I've fought them. And there is great differences there. But there are outliers even in a society such as the one we decide we want to have and collude to participate in, whom they are not us. They're not human like you and me conceptualize between each other. They are closer to animal and thus inhumane. They're not they're not somebody who's actually nice, but they suffer from schizophrenia. I've known people like that. They're not just mentally ill, although that is part of it. They're not just poor, lost, desolate, alone, victim of circumstance, none of this other blah, 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 touchy-feely bull. That's all it is bull. They are not us. Therefore, they don't share what we do. Because fundamentally, they're not like me and you. They are on the direct outside of us. Therefore, the natural antithesis to us. That is that existence. That is them, these people, these deep, dark, and disturbed creatures that share the same shape as us and commit atrocious acts using it. Right? They will prey on your empathy. They will prey on your sympathy. They will manipulate you. They will gaslight you, project on you. You know, take for example, recent cases of criminals finally being rounded up in the USA. What is it they always do? And we find out that they're an evil, dark monster, you know, behind it all every time, based upon evidence and proof provided. Oh, I'm just a family man. Help me. Please, my friend. My friend. Please, please. My child. My wife. And then you find out they took some young girl back behind a school and chopped her head off for funsies. This is where I think the uncanny valley effect comes from. Because these creatures are just the same shape as me and you. And they copy what me and you do. But they are not humans. Not like the rest of us. And so something fundamentally with them is very much wrong and missing. Therefore, people get that uncanny valley effect, even from some other humans. Believe it, because those people, more often than not, are proven to be such. Right? So that being said, like I always say, don't compromise safety and security for nobody and nothing. Death and disaster is only a second away. Do what you can a day. Stay strapped or get clapped. And then when you meet one of these creatures, you could teach them the permanent rule of FAFO and take them away from our civilized society for good. But that being said, always be careful, always be cautious, always be wary. I'm not saying you have to be hypervigilant like me. I'm probably hypervigilant because of where I grew up, you know, and then where I've been all over the world. I've been to all the worst places too. But that being said, again, these people are not like me and you. And the sooner the vast majority can accept that, instead of getting caught up in the feelings only game, the sooner we can return to a higher trust society. And again, start moving towards true progress of human flourishing. I'm just saying. But let me know what you think in the comments below.
And it just so happened that less than a quarter of a mile away was a ranger station with a phone. And so they pull into the parking lot and Deborah calls the police. The police tell her to wait inside of her car and they'll be out in a couple of minutes and they're going to need her to bring them up to where she saw this body. So a couple of minutes goes by, the police show up and they tell them to drive back up the road but stop about 200 yards short of where you believe this woman's body is. And so Deborah and her husband, they get back in the car, they drive back up the road where they came from, and right at this point where the road turned very sharply is where Deborah knew on the other side of this turn would be this body. And so they pulled over on the side of the road, the police came up on their side and they said, yep, right around the corner you're going to find her lying on the ground on the left side. And so Deborah and her husband are just sitting in the car watching as the police go up, they make that turn and they kind of disappear out of sight, and then they see their spotlight moving around on the other side of this turn, and so they figure, okay, they're looking for the body. But after several minutes, the police came back down the road and they stopped next to Deborah's car and they said, you know what guys, we didn't see anything up there. There wasn't a body, there wasn't anything out of the ordinary. And Deborah would say to police, I'm not lying, I know what I saw. It was a woman's body right there in front of me. I know it, it's right over there. And they would tell her that we believe you, but we can't do anything because there's nothing up there. And
I bet you anything they stayed in the patrol car too and just did a searchlight. Man, look, this is why every time I've offered, high tier training to, law enforcement, and I get turned down and they're like, nah, no, thank you. I'm like, it's disappointing. It really is. Because then they could exit their vehicles, being able to overcome the fear of being without them. Right? And people are always saying, don't militarize the police. No, I say full militarization. Why? Because they'll be trained better. They will be apportioned better. There will be more of them because you can fill up numbers greater. And not to mention, their capability will be much higher. And they'll be able to do a lot more good. Instead of just leaving them as just, as like a civilian punching bags, which is what police nowadays are, even with the recovery that's happening at the moment. So yes, fully militarize the police. We should not be listening to those who want everything to be unsafe just to assuage their feelings. There has been no successful dominion, country, nation, nothing that's ever been able to sustain such things long term. There has always had to have been a need for structure, for law and order, right? And the capacity to enforce it. Without that, you don't have a high trust society. You have a criminally enabled populace where the greater criminals just breed more criminals. Right? Anyway, look, I'll keep that simple and succinct. Let me know what you think. Let's continue. But me personally, I would have immediately, along with my partner, cloverleaf the whole area. And what I mean by a cloverleaf is like, people know what a cloverleaf is. Or better yet, actually more like what I would have wanted to do was an echelon search pattern. So me and my partner, maybe 100 meters apart, cover the area for at least a mile in circumference. You check for prints, you check for belongings, you check for everything. And the thing is that under light, things that don't belong in nature shine bright quite often. Unless they're colored darkly, then they attract your eye in a different way. And especially with those high-powered, lights that you could thunk someone in the skull with and knock them senseless if you do it hard enough. But yeah, and, or me personally, I'd probably get a pair of thermals, and then, but yeah, I would want to dedicate as much as I could to this to ensure that when I go back to those who reported this, I can assure them I have done everything possible to take their report seriously and to assuage their fears. Because that's one of the things that law enforcement's supposed to be doing. Anyway, that being said, let's continue.
so they told Deborah and her husband to just head home, and they did. After Deborah and her husband took off and were gone, the two responding officers drove back to their police station, and once they were inside, they began speculating about what Deborah might have seen. And as they were talking, another officer came into the station, a guy by the name of Rich Strasser, and he overhears them, and he goes over, he's intrigued, and he asked them, what happened? What did you see? And they explained to him that this woman, Deborah, had spotted a supposed dead woman's body up on Bullion Bend. And as soon as he heard Bullion Bend, Rich remembered that just a couple of days ago, they had received a missing person report of a young woman named Christine Skubish and her young son named Nick, who had gone missing, and the last place they had been seen was up on Bullion Bend. And so Rich wondered if maybe there was a body up there, and maybe it was Christine's. And so the next morning, Rich got up early and he headed out to Bullion Bend, and when he reached the exact spot where Deborah had claimed to have seen this dead woman's body, he found a children's shoe. And so he stopped his car, he got out, he picked the shoe up, and he's looking around and he's looking for anything else that's out of the ordinary, but there's nothing on the road, there's no skid marks, there's no other debris, there's no other clothes, there's nothing. And so he walks over to the guardrail that overlooks this very steep embankment, and he looks down the other side, and at first all he sees is just trees everywhere, but as he's looking, he thinks he sees more clothing farther down the mountain. And so he climbs over the guardrail and he very carefully maneuvers his way down, and after only a couple of seconds he reaches a clearing in the branches and the trees, and he can see down to where the terrain kind of levels off, and right down there is a smashed up red 4-door sedan.
My immediate assumption was wrong, but I'll still make that assumption every time. Better to be paranoid than to be foolishly ignorant, or at least in my experience. I like how there's like this little random red house over here. I don't know if y'all can see it on the screen. There's like this little random like log house or something. There's a structure there with like a red roof. It's probably like a ranger station or something. Pretty cool. Anyway, that being said, let's continue. But yeah, if the officers had just gotten out, flicked lights on, did a mile in circumference search of the area, they could have found all this out much earlier. Instead, it took another guy to be like, wait, what if there is something there? I rest my case.
It was the same type of car that Christine Skubish had been driving when she went missing. And so Rich ran down the mountain, following debris all the way to this wrecked car. He goes around to the driver's side and he looks inside, and there in the driver's seat is Christine Skubish, and unfortunately she was deceased. And then on the passenger seat is her son, Nicky, and he is alive, but barely. He had gone 5 days without food or water. And doctors would say when Rich found him, he probably only had about 1, maybe 2 hours before he would have died as well. Authorities believe Christine fell asleep at the wheel and she drove off that embankment. Initially, Rich believed Deborah must have seen Christine when she was driving through the mountains and saw that woman on the side of the road. After her accident, Christine must have gotten out of her car and then climbed up that embankment and then laid on the road, hoping someone would see her, and then when no one stopped for her, she went back down to her car where she ultimately died. But, according to the coroner, that would have been impossible, because when Christine crashed off the road, she died on impact 5 days before Deborah saw that woman on the side of the road. So,
Oh, that poor kid. You know, stories of war don't really get to me, right? Maybe because I've experienced so many of them. Okay, but, you know, when it comes to adults and all that stuff, I'm like, look, we're adults. Okay, our futures are either set or they're not. And, you know, we've lived up to that point. That's how I look at it. I know it's very dark and pretty nihilistic, but it's the reality. Death can come for you at any second, no matter who you are and how safe you think you may be. It does not matter. It could be today, tomorrow, a second from now, or 100 years. It comes for us all. But kids are the future. Children, they are what's after us. And just thinking about that poor boy with his mother, you know, just staying by her side. You know, this is unfortunate to say, there's no loyalty, right? There is no loyalty like, you know, children to parents, especially, you know, when it comes to the boys. With girls, it's much more flimsy, right? Or maybe that's just a Western thing. I don't know about kids overseas. But, at least in the West, but on the average and the whole, when it comes to children and their parent, especially if it's as good as they can be, loving parent, they're going to stay by their parent's side. Now, sure, part of it is just out of, incapacity to know what's going on and what to do about it. But part of it is that familial loyalty of love and that bond. And this poor boy was with his mother the whole time. God Almighty. What must have been going through his head? Poor kid.
What could not have been Christine. To this day, no one knows for sure who or what Deborah saw on the side of the road. But it is objectively true that Rich only investigated Bully and Bend and found Nikki alive because of Deborah's police report about this dead woman on the side of the road. And Deborah was only on that road because she'd had this totally weird middle of the night urge to suddenly leave a relative's house and drive up into the mountains, something she had never felt before and didn't really know how to explain. So either this is an extremely strange set of circumstances, or Nikki had a guardian angel. As many of you may know,
Man, I feel for the kid, but he's alive. He's alive and hopefully making his mama proud. God bless him.
aside from telling stories on this YouTube channel, I also tell stories on my podcast, the MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories. But that's not all. In addition to that podcast, under the Ballen Studios umbrella, there is a whole host of other podcasts that you can binge right now, and their content, all of them, fall into the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious category. For example, if you're into baffling and horrifying medical mysteries, well, you should go check out my other podcast called MrBallen's Medical Mysteries. Or maybe you want to hear from some other voices within our studio, like Luke LaManna. Luke LaManna is a military veteran. He has a super iconic, really deep radio voice, and he has two shows. One is called Wartime Stories, where he basically looks at strange, dark, and mysterious wartime stories, and his other show is called Redacted, where he looks at information that used to be classified, and he dives into it with his military expertise and experience, and he basically shows you the lies and secrets and half-truths that the most powerful institutions in the world have been keeping from us. We also have shows that are just plain creepy and unsettling, like Bedtime Stories, hosted by Richard Weil, where he dives into the supernatural and cryptids and mysterious deaths. I mean, basically his whole kind of niche is things that keep you up at night. And then two other shows that fall into that sort of unsettling, creepy vibe are Late Nights with Nexpo, hosted by the famous YouTuber Nexpo, where he dives into true, crazy, scary stories. And then we also have another show called Run Fool, hosted by Rodney Barnes. And Rodney is like an icon in the horror genre at large.
I fucking love that. That's great. That's great. Run, fool. That's awesome. That's like people who critique, people in the movies doing really dumb stuff for the sake of the plot. It's like, why are you going into the bathroom where all the strange shit's happening? You shouldn't go there. Nope, don't open the door. Run, fool.
And on his show, he just dives into this wild, chilling lore, like horror lore. People love that show. Or if you're a history buff, you need to check out our new hit show called A Twist of History. It's hosted by Joel, who also has an amazing YouTube channel. It's called Let's Read. And on A Twist of History, he dives into epic stories that have shaped the world that we live in now. So if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, go check out these shows. You can look for them either by name or simply by looking for Ballen Studios on any podcast platform. They are available right now. Enjoy.
In 1980, Bobby Shafran was on his way up to Sullivan County Community College, which is 2 hours outside of New York City, to begin his freshman year. Even though he was from the area, he didn't know anybody that was going to this particular school, and so he was pretty nervous about it. Plus, he wasn't that popular in high school, and he had a hard time making friends. When he pulled into a parking spot at the school, he saw a sea of people getting out of their parents' cars and carrying boxes up to their dorm rooms. And so he took a deep breath, hopped out of his car, grabbed his backpack, and began walking across the lawn towards the dorm building. On his walk over, Bobby was surprised when he felt like all these random strangers on the lawn were looking at him like they knew him. And a couple people yelled out to him and said, "Hey, it's good to have you back here." And one girl actually ran up to him and kissed him on the cheek and said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so happy you're back." And Bobby said, "I think you got the wrong person. I don't know you." And she laughed and she just ran away. And so Bobby's totally bewildered by this because he doesn't know anybody, but everybody seems to know him. And so he walks up the steps and he goes inside the dorm building. And as he's walking down the hall, people are high-fiving him and patting him on the back. And then right as he's about to turn the corner towards his actual dorm room, someone down the hall behind him yells out, "Hey, Eddie, what's going on, man?" And Bobby knew whoever it was yelling at him. Because this whole situation had been so weird, he felt like this had to be a case of mistaken identity. And so Bobby turned around and he saw at the other end of the hall another student who he didn't know, clearly waving at him and yelling out, "Hey, Eddie, come here, what's going on, man?" And so Bobby walks up to him and says, "Hey, I'm not Eddie. I don't know what's going on, but everybody thinks I'm somebody that I'm not, but I'm not Eddie. Who's Eddie?" And the guy said, "Yeah, okay, Eddie, it's good to have you back here, man," and then walked off. And so Bobby's like, what is going on here?
Okay, this is either an extremely elaborate prank being done by some Okay, I'm going to address this immediately. The whole entire "it was just a prank, bro" bullshit has been carried on way too far. Nowadays, no one should put up with none of that. Someone tries to prank you and do some elaborate ass, like, horrible stuff like this, right? And cause you anxiety. And these things, if they're a prank like this, quite usually don't end well. Especially for the one being pranked. Go after these people. Press charges, get restraining orders, whatever. This type of behavior should not be tolerated. Why? Because it sets up a dangerous precedent of low trust. All right? It's just a prank, bro, has been used as an excuse to be nothing but absolutely, and I mean absolutely harmful to others just for the kicks of those participants. So instead of allowing it, destroy it. That being said, it's either that, people thinking it's harmless, or mistaken identity, or someone posing as them. Although I do understand the whole being alone on the college campus thing. I completely understand that shit. My family was not involved in any of my education, really, period. I had to go and get it myself. But yeah, I understand that part of it 100%, right? Because I'm an outsider here at this school. Sure, it's easier for me to do the whole social thing. It's not hard. You just suss out people, right? You do your observation. You make sure you're watchful and observant. Pay attention. And you'll find out very quickly the type of people you wish to associate with, right? And then network from. That's how that stuff works. For those of us who have always been finding themselves alone, most places that they've gone. So anyway, that being said, let's continue.
And so Bobby turns and he goes back up to his dorm room and he goes inside and he just shuts the door and he's thinking, I just want to be left alone for a second because this is not right. This is not how a freshman who doesn't know anyone gets welcomed at any school or any place in the world. This is totally unusual. And just a couple of minutes after being inside of his dorm room, he hears a knock on the door and Bobby's like, oh great, who is it now? Who is it that thinks I'm someone I'm not? So he opens the door and there's another student who he doesn't know who's standing there, and this guy, his face just drains of color and he starts shaking when he sees Bobby. And they're both looking at each other like, what's going on here? And the student says to Bobby, were you adopted? And Bobby said, yeah. And then the student said, is your birthday July 12th? And Bobby said, yeah. And so the student goes, okay, My name is Michael, and I am best friends with a guy named Eddie Galland, and you are his clone. You have got to be his identical twin. At this point, to Bobby, this almost made sense, but it was so crazy to imagine having some identical twin he didn't know about. And so Bobby asked Michael if he could go meet Eddie, because he's got to be a student here. And Michael said, well, actually, Eddie decided not to come back to school this year, which is probably why everyone you talked to was so excited to see you, because they love Eddie, and they thought you were him, and so they're psyched to have you back. After talking for a couple of minutes, Michael tells Bobby that they have to go call Eddie, and they have
Oh shit, dude. That's crazy. The chances of that are incredibly low too. The last time I've heard of any story like this, when I looked into the data and the statistics and numbers behind it, it was something like 1 in the millions, essentially, for people to find they had an identical twin, that they were adopted or swapped at birth or some shit like that. That is so incredibly rare.
to set up a meeting so that Bobby can meet Eddie and vice versa. And so Michael and Bobby run outside to a payphone booth. They hop inside, they're crammed in there, and they dial up Eddie. And as soon as Eddie answers, Bobby grabs the phone and just says, "Hey Eddie, my name's Bobby, and everybody thinks I'm you." And then Eddie says, "Yeah, I've been getting a lot of calls about that too." And Bobby would later say that when he first heard Eddie's voice, he said it sounded like his own voice coming through the phone. And so ultimately, Eddie invited Bobby and Michael to come to his house so that Eddie and Bobby could see if it really was true that they were twins. And so Michael and Bobby hopped in Bobby's car and they sped 2 hours to Eddie's house. And when they got there, it was the middle of the night, and Eddie's house is the only house in this quiet suburb that has all the lights on. And so Michael and Bobby walk up the path towards the front door of Eddie's house, and right as Bobby is about to knock on the door, it flies open, and standing in front of Bobby is his exact clone. It's Eddie. And Eddie's looking back at Bobby, and he can't believe what he's looking at. They are definitely identical twins, and they both immediately saw that. Michael would say after Bobby and Eddie just stared at each other for about a minute, they just started laughing. It was like they were total strangers, but at the same time, they had this connection immediately.
That is hilarious. That is hilarious. I freaking love this. That's great. That's great. They do look identical. Although one's a bit chubbier than the other one. The other one's a bit more lean. But that's about the only difference I can see. Jesus Christ. Well, talk about small miracles, right? I'm happy about this too. This is a nice story.
Laughing.
Wait, since he's putting a nice story here, does that mean the next one's gonna be really bad?
It was like they were total strangers, but at the same time, they had this connection immediately. They knew they were related, and they were laughing, and they hugged, and they just stared at each other. And Michael said anytime Bobby would tilt his head, Eddie would mimic it, and vice versa. It was like they were looking into a mirror. Shortly after, this story of these two long-lost brothers reconnecting found its way to Newsday, which was a prominent local newspaper in New York, and they decided they would look into it to see if it was really true or not. And so one of the editors had a junior reporter fly out and actually see Bobby and Eddie face to face and see if it was really true that they were in fact identical twins. And as soon as this reporter saw them, they knew immediately that, yep, they're related. And so Newsday printed this totally heartwarming fairy tale story about these two long-lost brothers reconnected after all these years just because of a chance encounter in college. And everybody loved it. But this is where the story went from amazing to truly unbelievable.
Oh boy, so I wonder what happened to where they were separated. Did mom just say, "I don't want a second kid," and put the other one up for adoption? Where they switched in the cradles at the hospital? Because that happens often, even today. Although it's arguable if it happens more today or less today, depending on which of what you look at. Anyway, but yeah, I wonder what it was. My best guess would be my best guess would be swapped at birth or something like that. Or I don't know. The two greatest potentials I could think of is mom didn't want two kids, or, and put up for adoption, or somebody swapped the baby somehow, lost in translation or something, but the other child was lost for sure. And then ended up in the foster system. So, huh.
Friends of another young man living in the New York area named David Kelman began telling David that he had to check out this Newsday article about these long-lost twins because these two twins look exactly like David. Specifically, they said you gotta look at these guys' hands. They are just like yours, David. David was known for having these enormous hands, and a lot of the pictures of Bobby and Eddie in the news showed their hands, and they too were enormous. And so David finally picked up a newspaper and looked at a picture of Bobby and Eddie, and sure enough, he was shocked. They looked exactly like him. And then when he read the article, it showed their birthday was July 12th, the same as his, and they were born at the same hospital he was born at. And so he's thinking, these are too many coincidences. They have to be my brothers.
There was three of them? What happened to Mom? Where's she at? And what was she doing? How did they all get lost? Or they were all adopted? Or something approximating that. And they all ended up separated. Where's Mom? Hell, where's Dad? This is insane. Plus, the clothes and the hairstyles and everything, nostalgia drip for me. Some would argue we probably should go back to that. Simpler times. But yeah, this is insane. I guess 3 times the charm. And holy shit, dude. There's triplets. Where is Mom? That's my first concern. Where's the mother?
And so David called Eddie's home phone number, and Eddie's mother picked up and she asked who was calling. And David said, "Hi, my name is David Kelman. I was born July 12th, 1961, and I'm looking at a newspaper article of 2 identical twins that look just like me, and one of them is your son. I think I'm the missing 3rd twin." After hearing this, Eddie's mom apparently dropped the phone and yelled out, "They're coming out of the woodwork!" So Eddie and Bobby went to David's house, and as soon as they walked in and saw David, they knew right away he was one of them. He was the 3rd twin. And apparently, within minutes of meeting.
So Mom is still alive. She got a phone call about a potentially missing son. And okay, I can understand if she's getting harassed, right? That happens. There's too many freaking wackadoodles out there and weirdos and freaks that want to all be part of the story, get their 15 minutes of fame and share in on the big moment, because everybody wants to be, famous, is the old saying. But it then perverts great moments like these and twists them. If you're one of those types of people, my God, do they deserve a punch in the face for the shit they do to those who are having moments like these and try to make it all about them or you or whatever. Urgh. Anyway, that being said, I understand if Mama is being negatively impacted by all this publicity around everything. She's probably getting calls off the hook left, right, and center. But my big concern is, where has Mother been with all of this? She's immediately jumping to, they're coming out of the woodwork. She didn't know she had triplets? What did she do? How can you give birth to triplets and not even know? I mean, I understand that women have birth amnesia. I understand this. But that only stretches so far. How do you lose two kids? I mean, I understand it might have been the hospital and they screwed up somehow. Or, you know what? Man, let me know what y'all think in the comments down below. This, holy shit.
Each other. They were wrestling and laughing hysterically on the ground. It was like even though they were strangers, they somehow already knew each other and had an instant connection. David's family members that witnessed this first interaction said it was the most incredible thing they had ever seen, that it was just so wonderful to see these long-lost siblings finally reconnected after all these years. Shortly after David realized he was the third missing twin, Newsday did another story talking about how there was actually 3 missing twins that had all been reconnected, and once again, it was just this incredible Cinderella story, and now this story went all over the world. They were on the cover of every magazine, every newspaper, they were on every talk show, and everybody had the same question. What similarities did they discover? And they would say, well, we all wrestled in junior high school and high school, we all smoked the same cigarettes, we like the same food, we had the same taste in women. And on talk shows, when they would answer these questions, it was immediately clear that they all shared the same mannerisms, and on the show, they would routinely interrupt each other and finish each other's sentences. It really was like they were the exact same person, despite having been raised completely separate from one another. The boys loved the attention they were getting. They had become international rock stars overnight, and all 3 of them were immediately so close. They were best friends right away. They moved into an apartment together. They went out partying. They met Madonna. It was just this incredible time in their lives. And so they weren't asking questions about why they had been separated in the first place.
That is so crazy. It is so crazy. But I do look forward to getting the answers as to that question myself.
But their parents were asking a lot of questions because they had not been told by the adoption agency that the boy they were adopting actually had 2 identical siblings. They had no idea. So the boy's adoptive parents reached out to the adoption agency, which was Louise Wise Services. It's based in New York.
Oh, okay, so it was adoptive mother. It was the adopted mother that was the one that was getting all the calls. Okay, that makes sense. Never mind. I failed to draw that connection early on.
Very prestigious, basically the most powerful and wealthy people in New York use this adoption agency if they're going to adopt. And so the parents reached out to them and asked for a meeting so they could get some answers as to why their kids have been separated. And so the parents go to New York, they go into this meeting room with the top brass of Louise Wise Services, and they say, did you separate our sons at birth on purpose? And one of the executives said, yes, we did, because it's really hard to place 3 children into one home. At which point David's adoptive father lashed out and said, that's absolute BS. If you had told me he had 2 identical siblings, I would have taken all 3. But the agency stood by their decision and said that's the only reason it happened, and so sorry, that's all we can tell you. And so the parents were very frustrated and felt like there was much more to the story, and in fact, they felt like the agency was actually lying to them about why they had separated their sons in the first place. But
so this is going to be traced back to the adopted, to the biological parents. Oh man, I look forward to seeing what the conclusion of this is. Why did they give up triplets to adoption? All right, there's only so many reasons for that. Now, people will say out of love because they couldn't provide. Poor people have kids all the time. I'm one of them. And I can provide any and all for my son, but I'm sacrificing from myself to do so. And I'm fine with that because I love my son, and I've always wanted my son. So I don't buy that excuse, period. It doesn't hold water with me. Not at all. Right? Which swings me to the other side of things. Like, look, if you want to have kids, you have to accept you're going to sacrifice for them. Period. That's an obligation, duty, and responsibility of being a parent, of ushering in the next generation of the human existence. The future of humanity is children. So beyond the personal is also, the different orders of magnitude and the interpersonal as well. So those excuses never hold water with me, especially when it comes to women. Because, the story is always women giving up the children because they can't provide for them. But they can provide for themselves? Same thing with the uh, um, extreme edge cases of men giving up children. Women give up children far more frequently than men do. Men have to literally be driven out of the home by the gynocentric legal system and forced away from the children. Because more often than not, the men want to be in the children's lives, but they're not allowed to be because the system's rigged against them. So again, that excuse of giving up the children for the love of the children holds no water for me. Because if you loved them, you would find a way in which to provide for them, and that would mean sacrificing from yourself, which to me is more selfishness than anything else, based upon that logic. So I don't buy that excuse, period. Right? Now, I understand why people think they can't have kids today, but it's only because they don't want to sacrifice from themselves to provide, which is inherently selfish and selfishness. So that being said, again, that doesn't hold any water with me, period. And I will judge. So what in the hell else could have happened to where she gave up 3 kids? Did she die? Did the family break up and the dad was murderous or the mother was murderous? And then one or the other had to give up the kids? Let me know what your thoughts are on everything I said in the comments. I'm really intrigued in this.
They couldn't get any more information, so they left the agency. And right when they got outside, Bobby's father realized he had left his umbrella inside of the meeting room. And so he turned around, went back inside, walked down the hall quietly so he didn't want to disturb anyone. And he opened the door to the meeting room and he reached in to get his umbrella. And he looked inside and he saw the people he had just met with from Louise Wise Services had just opened a bottle of champagne, and they were laughing and smiling, and they were clearly toasting each other on a job well done. And even though Bobby's father did not go in there and confront them about what they were celebrating, he got the sense that they were celebrating having dodged a bullet, that they clearly had just lied to the families of these 3 triplets and they'd gotten away with it. And so between the parents' general sense that the agency was clearly hiding something and then Bobby discovering this champagne toast as soon as they left, the parents decided they needed to get in touch with some lawyers to help them get to the bottom of why their sons had been separated. And so initially, a number of really prestigious law firms in New York were excited to take this case. But shortly after, they all contacted the families to say, well, actually, there's a conflict and we can't do it anymore. And the parents believed this was because the adoption agency, Louise Wise Services, and some of their more prominent and powerful clients were pressuring the lawyers not to dig into this, that clearly there was some secret that they did not want uncovered. And so unfortunately, the parents hit a dead end and didn't know where else to turn to try to get more information. And so over time, they kind of just accepted that this is just the way it is. And as for their sons, they didn't really care that much because the way they looked at it, at least they had each other now. And so
Someone very powerful and very wealthy, an elite, is what we call them colloquially, even though they're not truly elite. Only by dint of circumstance of their position, power, influence, and wealth are they elite. Otherwise, they're literally you and me. If not below us morally and ethically, because they're demons up there. There's very few good ones with all of that. Someone very rich and powerful got rid of these kids to keep a secret. That's beyond dispute. And the agency was in on it. I bet you if you look through the donor list and you trace back everything from the agency outward, it might take a couple of years, but I guarantee you'd find some names attached to some pictures. And if you compare them to the boys, it would probably draw a direct line from one to the other. Somebody did something untoward, and they wanted it hidden and covered up and put the boys in adoption and had them all separated so there was never the chance the secret could come to life. That is my conclusion, but let me know what you think.
So over the years, the boys continued to stay really close. They started families of their own and had lots of family get-togethers. It was just a really happy time in all of their lives. And at some point, the boys actually went into business together and opened their own restaurant in New York called Triplets. And the first year, it was extremely successful, did over $1 million in revenue. But in the second year, the brothers started to fight with each other about how to run the restaurant. And in many ways, this was their first major conflict. They hadn't grown up together. They had never really fought. And so now they're fighting over money and how to run the business, and it got really bad really quick, and they just could not come to any sort of compromise. And so at some point, Bobby left the business. He said, I don't want to do this with you guys anymore. And apparently his departure just completely ruined the dynamic of the three brothers. Eddie was the most affected by this fracture in their relationships. All he wanted was for his brothers to be really close and for their families to spend time together, and now all of that was in jeopardy. And so Eddie started showing signs of severe depression and was ultimately hospitalized for 3 weeks. And then shortly after getting out of the hospital, he took his own life. This was beyond devastating for the two brothers and the rest of their family. Around this time, a journalist named Lawrence Wright, who had always had a fascination with identical twins, found an obscure scientific article called Psychoanalytic Study of the Child. It detailed a New York-based study about identical twins that were intentionally separated at birth and then given to different adoptive families to be studied, although it wasn't clear what they were actually studying or why they needed identical twins to do this research. In this article, Lawrence discovered all the babies that had been used in the study came from the same adoption agency, the same one the triplets had come from, the Louise Wise Services in New York. And so Lawrence called Bobby and told him that based on this article, it seems like he and his brothers were used in a scientific study. Bobby and David were totally furious. They felt like they'd been treated like lab rats. They also wondered if their being separated at birth had a negative impact on their mental health, and that might have contributed to Eddie's depression and untimely death. Lawrence wound up writing an article about this twin study he had discovered, and after he published it, another set of twins found out they had been a part of the study and discovered themselves. These two women were also struggling with depression, furthering the idea that the study could have led to irreparable harm to their subjects' mental well-being.
My assumption for such a study is to scientifically try to study the link, when it comes to biology between blood relatives, right? So parents and children, and to figure out nature versus nurture. Its penultimate goal. That's my immediate assumption. Which is freaking wild. Because you would think, right, that in science, because scientists are promoted as these, ultimately morally and ethically good on every level people, generally and on the whole. And there's plenty that do fall into that stereotype until they are pressured or paid or otherwise influenced not to do the right thing to ensure their own ends. There's a reason why the crazy scientist, the mad scientist, or the evil scientist is such a strong trope, because it is true. And the how, when, why, what, and where doesn't matter. But it does matter the who. Just like the medical field. The Hippocratic Oath is, I shall do no harm. Yet, what have we seen the last decade being proven over and over again? Those who have taken that same oath have done the most harm in pursuit of self-interest alone.
At this point, David and Robbie did not expect anybody to be held accountable for this study. Instead, they just hoped to find out why it was done and what they were testing for and what the results were. And so they began working with Lawrence to try to get those answers. They contacted Louise Wise Services, who did admit that yes, actually this was part of a study, but they didn't give any information about what the results were or why they did it. And so they did some digging and they discovered the guy in charge of the actual scientific study was this doctor named Peter Neubauer, who was this very well-known psychologist in New York. And so Lawrence managed to get an interview with this doctor, but the doctor basically said, I won't answer any of your questions and I won't give you any information about this study. And he he never published his findings. Right before the doctor died in 2008, he made sure the entire study was put under seal inside of the Yale University archives so no one could access it until 2066, which has led many people to believe that the reason he set it so far out was to guarantee all of these subjects in this study would have died by the time it was made publicly available, protecting his own legacy and the people that were involved in this study.
4chan should break into that vault and expose the study anyway. Screw this dude. To hell with him. I don't give a shit if it's Yale, Berkeley, Harvard, frickin' hell. I don't care what university or higher, self-declared higher institution it is. I don't give a shit. Break that shit open and expose it to the world. People who have conducted immoral and unethical actions should not be given human rights. They shouldn't be given human dignity. They should not be treated as human. They should be treated as the inhuman, right, evil actors that they are. So no, screw this dude, right? 4chan, get on it. They're the only ones I could think of who could pull it off, honestly. Right? They are the weaponized autism of the internet, and they're extremely effective. That being said, yeah, no, you've done all this bad thing. You do not deserve protection. You don't deserve the rights or the privileges given to you by a civilized society that place trust in you for your position and your role in it. You betrayed that. Therefore, you also betrayed the Hippocratic Oath as well. No, absolutely not. I would happily crack through frickin' Yale myself and frickin' rip open that shit to see what it is. And then throw those copies of it all over the internet everywhere. I'd happily do so. Unfortunately, I couldn't afford to go all the way to Yale. I'm a broke boy. I'm a retired veteran. And the pension barely even gets me a box to live in. So, unfortunately, I can't do that right now. But yeah, screw this dude. And everybody like him.
In the recent documentary called Three Identical Strangers, Dr. Neubauer's personal assistant, a woman by the name of Natasha Josefowitz, she was interviewed and they asked her, can you shed any light on why this study was done, what they were testing for, and what the results were? And she would say that she was not actually part of the study. She was more on the periphery, but she was privy to what they were doing. And she said the point of the study was to finally put to bed whether it was nature or nurture that made the person who they ultimately become. Basically, are your surroundings the thing that ultimately makes you who you become, or is it just your genetic makeup that you're predestined to become?
It's not versus. It's both. The determining common denominator in every single one of these cases and every single one of these studies that these supposed frickin' experts and subject matter experts and scientists and researchers and everything's always missing, because they're agenda driven, not science driven, is the common denominator is us. You and me are the common denominator in the middle that bridges the gap between nature and nurture. It doesn't take science to reconfirm what's been known for thousands of years already. The reason they're looking into it, right, is to use what they found. It's not for the conducive benefit good or forward progress and human flourishing. It's not for none of that. They were looking into this to learn how to use it for power and control and nothing else. Otherwise, why hide it? Why keep it from exposure? Why not release the results? If it's something good and conducive, would it not be best to have it in the light? Why is it allergic to the light? Because it is inherently dark. And when light is shed upon it, the form is truly ugly. It's evil, plain and simple. Period. No, there needs to be no discussion about this. It is the two, with the bridge in between being me and you. So yeah, I'd triple down, quadruple down, sextuple down on what I said earlier. Screw that dude.
A particular person independent of how you were raised. And she said the results were incredible, that basically it has nothing to do with nurture. It's all about your genetic makeup, that we unconsciously trend towards specific behaviors and decisions, but we believe it's free will. We believe we're choosing to do certain things, but in reality, it's basically predetermined. And specifically,
she's on an agenda as well. The thing is that at your base, yes, just like a building, okay? To make a building anywhere on the planet, what do you need first? What has to come before the building to ensure that the building can be even put together on top? Is an absolute foundation. Without that absolute foundation, with which is acting as a base on which to put on structure, right? Everything else is going to fall apart now, isn't it? That base structure, that absolute foundation, is our physiological, biological makeup. It's what we start from. How these people don't know this shit is beyond me. They come to their own conclusions despite the evidence of humanity as a whole. It is freaking, it's insanity. Nature versus nurture, humanity in between as the bridge, right? You start from, and then the two are combined. That being said, anyway, let's continue.
in the triplets case, Bobby was intentionally placed into a more affluent household where his father was a doctor and his mother was a lawyer, and so they were very well educated, and that was his upbringing. Eddie was placed into a more middle-class family with his father being a teacher and his mom being a stay-at-home mother. And David was put into a low-income household where they were all immigrants, English was a second language, and they just had this very small shop that they owned. And Natasha said this study demonstrated that despite these boys being put into different socioeconomic levels, it had almost no impact on who they ultimately became. She said she doesn't know why the study wasn't published, but she hopes someday it will be. Also,
if it had no effect on who they became, right? Removing the nurture, which is the environmental factor. If that had no effect, right? How did they end up when it came to their lives as adults? That's what's being left out here. The truth of the matter is that they were all collectively good-natured. True. They shared that in common. True. But then they had a fight and a falling out that led to the death of one. So obviously there was determining factors in the nurture part that had disparities that were generated between them. Or at least that's my immediate conclusion. Let me know what y'all think. I'll try to stop talking as much.
So in this documentary, a doctor named Lawrence Perlman, who was actually one of the researchers in the study that would actually make house visits to each of the boys' houses as they were growing up under the false pretext that they were there as part of routine follow-up for the adoption agency. And he went on record and said that the study was not just about the effects of socioeconomic class, it was really about the effects of different styles of parenting. He said in the triplets case, each of the boys had been placed into their respective households after that household had already adopted another child. And that first child they adopted effectively became the guinea pig for this study, where scientists would come in and they would study this child under the false pretext that they were there just following up for the adoption agency, but really they were creating a baseline of how do these parents parent. And then once that baseline was established, then the triplets were sent into their respective homes, with the researchers knowing full well how they were each going to be brought up, with the adoptive father being the X factor. Bobby's father, who was a doctor, was rarely around, but he was devoted and loving to his son. David's father, who was the shop owner, was around all the time and adored his son and loved him unconditionally. Eddie's father was a teacher who was around a fair amount, but when he was very strict and rough with Eddie and quick to discipline him and rarely showed any affection for him. And while Dr. Perlman does not come out and say that Eddie's relationship with his father probably had an effect on him becoming depressed and ultimately taking his life, there are many other people close to this case that believe that's exactly what it was, that David and Bobby had a stable, healthy upbringing and Eddie did not. And so when he was faced with the crisis of the brothers separating, Eddie couldn't handle it. These same people refute what Natasha said about the findings of the study, that we're all genetically predisposed to become a particular person. They say if that was the case, then why haven't David and Bobby taken their lives? But ultimately, because the study was never published, we won't know for sure why it was done, what they studied, and what the conclusions were. All we have is speculation and second and third hand information. But what we do know for sure is these surviving triplets and their families are furious that this study was done. They feel like it ruined their lives. Following the release of the documentary Three Identical Strangers, Bobby and David were actually granted early access to the study that was sealed inside of Yale University.
Good on them. Good on them. I hope they expose it, although I don't know if they will.
And when they looked at it, they were expecting to be blown away with the results, but it turned out it was over 10,000 pages of very technical information, and much of it was heavily redacted, so they couldn't even read most of it. They were not able to deduce what the purpose of the study was in the first place, or what it accomplished. It was just all very ambiguous. This study was ultimately shut down permanently in 1980, the same year the triplets discovered themselves. As for the adoption agency, Louise Wise Services, and all the scientists and researchers involved in the study, none of them were held accountable for their role in this totally unethical study, and so basically everything was swept under the rug. And so Bobby, David, and all of the family members of the triplets were just left with a whole bunch of questions and not a lot of answers.
What did I say much earlier before the conclusion was released? And look, when I went and, did my stint in medical school, right? Everything there is bare bones. It's not really in depth or very advanced. I had to go and look up a lot of shit by my damn self. Goddamn, what a waste of money. And it didn't net me anything positive, unfortunately, except, furthering and expanding my knowledge when it comes to anatomy, physiology, and all that. How the human body works for the most part, how to keep the human body from completely ending itself and all these things. But look, at the end of the day, you don't need to be someone who's credentialed or certified and a declared expert or authoritative source in order to know the literature. You don't need none of that shit. You do it yourself. Right? And what I learned was that it just reconfirmed everything I already knew from my own life experiences already, especially when it came to children. And the thing is that nature, right? Nature, nurture, us in between that bridges the gap. Sure, there are biological and physiological predispositions. But at the end of the day, ultimately, what's the common denominator between them all, where everything anchors down to and comes from, is here, us. That is the major determining factor. But nature and nurture combined also are a factor in itself within that anchor point. So, in conclusion, right, it makes sense that One of them was predisposed due to the nature of their relationship with a parental figure towards being super happy and jovial with everybody that treated them well. Right? Now, people will call me a strict father, and they would say I'm more like the teacher, father, out of this equation. No, I do basically a very precarious balancing act between all of it, right? Because you need some elements of the teacher father, but you also need elements of the other two. In this scenario, I try to be all of those for my son, right? And I'm always observant, watching, and paying attention to what nets best result, what nets bad result, right? And then bridging the two, and seeing what goes further and what goes and what goes further and what detracts. Unfortunately, the vast majority of parents are not as involved as I am, unfortunately. Much as I would greatly love to see that be a thing. We'd have a much better world at the moment. But yeah, what did I say earlier? It's not either or, it's all three. Man. Bub, it's so cute. It really is. I'm a dad, so I'm imagining like this being a bunch of my sons. I'd love for them to be just like this, but my son's going to be the oldest kid no matter what. It's going to take me a while to find someone else to get him some siblings. And he asks for them all the time. But it's going to take me a while. Plus, I'm only getting older, so I better find someone willing to accept that fact.
On December 18th, 1956, a brand new game show called To Tell the Truth aired on a major American television network. The premise of the show was relatively simple. 4 celebrity judges would be presented with 3 people called contestants who all claimed to be the same person. And this person who they claimed to be was always remarkable in some way. They had some incredible talent or some crazy job, or they had accomplished something extraordinary.
I haven't heard about this show in so long ago. Holy shit, Bub. This is great. This is great.
One of these 3 contestants was the real person they were claiming to be. The other 2 people were doing their best to pretend to be that person. And it was the job of the celebrity judges to try to figure out who was telling the truth. So for a set amount of time on the show, the celebrity judges would ask the contestants questions about their background and try to figure out, who was who. And then at the end of the time, the celebrities would cast a vote about who they thought was the real remarkable person. After the votes were tallied up, the host would have the real remarkable person stand up to reveal themselves, and the entire audience would go crazy, and that was the show. And the show became quite popular. So popular, in fact, that today, nearly 70 years later, it's still on the air. And over this show's very long history, virtually all the episodes are pretty similar. It's a pretty redundant show. But there is one episode that will forever go down as the most unique. In October of 1972, 3 contestants walked out onto the stage in front of the 4 celebrity judges, and they all introduced themselves as Ed Edwards. Then the host of the show read aloud the biography of the real Ed Edwards, and he would say that Ed at one point was on the FBI's list of the top 10 most wanted criminals in America for crimes like armed robbery and impersonating a federal officer, and then after he was finally caught by law enforcement and went to prison, a prison guard helped him turn his life around, and then upon release from prison 14 years later, Ed remained this reformed criminal and became a successful author and motivational speaker who specialized in telling people how to identify con men and criminals and how to protect themselves from these people.
Well, that's a hell of a turnaround. Thankfully, there's plenty of such cases. Thankfully.
After the real Ed Edwards biography was read aloud, the three contestants sat down and the celebrity judges began asking them questions about their past. And then after the time was up, the celebrity judges...
I forgot. It was what's his name from MASH. He was on one. That's right. That's right. He's from MASH. I forget the name of his character now. It was a long time ago for me. Right, I was still quite young when this was still airing. But yeah, man.
began asking them questions about their past, and then after the time was up, the celebrities cast their votes, and then the real Ed Edwards was revealed.
Will the real Ed Edwards please stand up?
And even though 2 of the 4 celebrity judges had correctly identified the right Ed Edwards, the crowd was totally astonished at who this guy actually was, because he did not look like this ex-convict. He looked like this kind of all-American middle-aged father who was totally harmless and wouldn't hurt a fly. But either way, the show ended, and then the world forgot about Ed Edwards until 2009. That
Yep. I tell people, they look like you and me, but they're up to no good.
year, Ed's estranged daughter, 40-year-old April Blasio, finally decided to investigate something that had plagued her for her whole childhood. Despite her father's claims that he was this reformed criminal and this stand-up, law-abiding guy, she didn't believe it. She never believed it. She thought he had never been reformed and just was a criminal and always had been. Behind closed doors, Ed was violent and abusive, and he was a compulsive liar. She remembered in the 1970s and 80s when she was a young kid, Ed would make their family pack up and move sometimes in the middle of the night, and April always assumed it was because her dad was wrapped up in something criminal. But every time she asked him, he would say, oh, well, you know, I was an informant when I was in jail and I snitched on some people, and some of those people have figured out where we live, and so we gotta move.
And what's funny is that the cases like Ed's are used to demonize all men, even though the such cases of men doing such things similar or peripheral to this are actually in the minority compared to the vast majority of men. And we both know who I'm talking of that does such things.
April knew he was lying, but there was nothing she could do, and so they just kept on moving around. But she always thought something else was going on. So in 2009, when April is now this 40-year-old woman, she's laying in bed one night and finally says, you know what, I'm just gonna start Googling some stuff. So she hops in her laptop and she starts typing in the different names of towns that she and her family lived in as a kid. And then after she'd write the name of the town, she'd write unsolved mystery or unsolved crime, and she would see if anything popped up. And so as she began looking, she found one in 1980. It was an unsolved murder in a town called Watertown, Wisconsin, that happened right around the time that her family very briefly lived in this town. There was this young teenage couple that had left this wedding and they had driven down this dead-end road and they were just kind of enjoying each other's company when an unknown assailant who matched the description of Ed Edwards walked up to their car, broke in, shot them both to death, and then disappeared. And so on a hunch, April called the Watertown Police Department the following day and told them that, I think my father might have been responsible for this double homicide. It's just a hunch, but he matches the description. We were there in this very small window of time when it happened. And so the police said, okay, we'll go have a look. And so the Watertown police, they tracked down Ed Edwards, who was living in Kentucky at the time, and they got him to give them a DNA sample. And when they tested the DNA sample, it matched the samples that were taken at the crime scene in 1980. And so Ed Edwards, he was arrested and brought back to Wisconsin, and as soon as he was in custody, he confessed to the murder. And then he requested the death penalty. But he was told the maximum punishment for this crime was life in prison. Ed didn't like this, and so he confessed to another double homicide from 1977 in Ohio, where he killed another teenage couple, thinking that would give him the death penalty. But through a loophole, they said, well, actually, that still won't get you the death penalty. You're still facing life in prison. And so frustrated, Ed revealed a third murder he had perpetrated. In 1996, he had killed his own foster son for the insurance money. And so for this crime, he was eligible for capital punishment, and so he was sentenced to death.
The bastard didn't want to suffer. He wanted to escape long-term justice, which, look, I'm all about the death penalty. I'm all for it. Remove them, don't waste the money on them, right? Or use them. At least, I think if you committed such crimes, you're ineligible for human rights and dignity. You should be a slave at the very best. That's my belief. Let me know what you think, though. But yeah, the bastard just didn't want to suffer. Ooh, I would love to shoot the face off of this one. Maybe twice.
But he would die of natural causes 2 years later in 2011 before the state could execute him. Since his death, cold case investigators and members of his own family have theorized that Ed Edwards is almost certainly responsible for more killings beyond just the 5 he happened to confess to. In fact, many people believe Ed Edwards could actually be the infamous Zodiac Killer, who's one of the nation's most notorious uncaught serial killers that killed 37 people in Northern California in the 1960s and 1970s. If this is true, then Ed Edwards did not become a killer after he was on that game show in 1972. No, when he showed up for that game show and stood in front of the audience and smiled and answered questions to the celebrity panelists, at that time, as you're watching him on TV, he would have already been a seasoned serial killer with dozens and dozens of victims. But Ed stopped confessing to murders after that third confession because he was just kind of using those murders as bargaining chips to get what he wanted, the death penalty. And once he got it, he went silent. And now that he's dead, we're never going to get another confession out of him, and there's no proof connecting him to any unsolved murder cases. And so unfortunately, it's unlikely we'll ever know the full extent of Ed's reign of terror.
And he has those soulless eyes, right, that many people, are familiar with. Those eyes of someone that is missing what makes you and me humane. They look human. He looks human. No doubt. But the eyes betray a lot. A huge amount.
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
All right. Thank you very much, MrBallen. A pleasure as always, my fellow combat veteran. That being said, what do y'all think? What do y'all think? Me, I enjoyed it. I knew I was going to enjoy it. It's MrBallen, right? It's Alan himself. Oh, shit. This is 2 hours. No one's watching this, I don't think. But if you did, well then, thank you very much. And I appreciate it. That being said, you let me know what you think in the comments down below. All right. You know what time it is. Be good. Be safe. Make good life for yourselves. Don't compromise safety and security for nobody and nothing. Death and disaster is only a second away. Do what you can today. And I will see y'all in the next one. I am Badger 7 Actual, the formerly homeless veteran. Blast Cat Badger, out.